The Center for World War II Studies and Conflict Resolution at Brookdale Community College presents its Fall 2012 lecture series. In this program, The Monuments Men, with Professor Emeritus of History at Brookdale Community College, Jack Needle. As Hitler was attempting to conquer the Western world, his armies were methodically pillaging the finest art in Europe. The Monuments Men had expertise as museum directors, curators, art scholars, and educators, artists, architects, and archivists. Their job was simple: to save as much of the culture of Europe as they could during World War II. At the lectern to introduce Professor Needle is Paul Zygo, the director of the Center for World War II Studies and Conflict Resolution at Brookdale Community College.
Good evening, everybody. And I really do mean that. Good evening. After all that we've been through over these past 2 weeks, it's a pleasure seeing you all sitting here. In fact, as I've done with my students today, what I asked them to do was please stand up, and I'm going to ask you to do the same thing. Please stand up for a moment, if you would. Yeah, please, everyone. Turn to your colleague or your friend, left or right of you, shake their hand or hug them. Because you've all been through a very historic, traumatic experience. And guess what? You're survivors. So thank you all for being here. Truly, you've all been through a very historic, traumatic experience. I don't think any of us have ever experienced like this within our lifetime. And I do not believe that New Jersey and the Northeast Coast have ever experienced this within its historic times. So we are living in a moment of history. Welcome all aboard. My name is Paul Zygo. I'm the director of the Center for World War II Studies and Conflict Resolution, and am pleased to be here tonight to introduce to you a speaker who helped establish the center some 12 years ago. He also is an individual that helped establish Brookdale's Holocaust Center some 25 years ago. So he's a major contributor to Brookdale, the educational system, as well as Brookdale history. Tonight, he's going to be talking about an aspect of World War II which is little known. But I think as you hear him talk about this aspect, you'll become very much interested in what he has to say, because he's revealing quite a bit of new history. Much of what he's going to be revealing has really not been known. In fact, as you're looking at a lot of the things that Jack is putting up on the screen right now, a lot of it might be handwritten, because he's still in the process of researching this topic. Hopefully someday in the future he might write a book. What do you think, Jack? Not to put him on the spot. All right. And who am I talking about? Well, Professor Emeritus Jack Needle. He's been one of the founding members of the Brookdale History Department, and as mentioned before, has contributed much to its development and the development of two major centers here on campus. He's going to be talking about the Monuments Men. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Emeritus Jack Needle.
Thanks, Thank you. Thank you. And I didn't know I was being invited to a love-in. What started off as an official theft from individuals by the Nazis very rapidly turned into theft from nations. The art, the libraries, the patrimony, the heritage of nations was stolen by the thousands of truck and railroad cars, and that was shipped off to Greater Germany. This is the extent of Hitler's empire. You can see the yellow are the Axis powers, and the green is the occupied territory, and the purple are allies. If you look here, everything to the left was considered by the Nazis as Untermenschen territory. So whatever happened here happened much more so in this area than the West. But wherever the Nazis went, they established law. Law was out. Whatever a Gauleiter said, whatever an SS officer said, that was law. So they started off looting individuals and groups, and then, as I said, they attacked nations. It's estimated that 20% of Europe's art was looted by Nazis, Hitler minions. That's estimated over $1 trillion. And when you think of the value of things, paintings that were worth $100,000 then are worth $45 million now. From ancient times, of course, victors would always claim the spoils of war. The Romans paraded captives and their national icons as trophies. Napoleon enriched France and the Louvre with all kinds of art and loot that he took from nations which he conquered. Even the British, although they were not involved in the war, took the statues from the pediment of the Parthenon in Athens under the guise of protecting them. The so-called Elgin marbles, which reside in the British Museum, are even now under an attempt to be reclaimed by the Greek government. To prevent the despoilization of a nation's cultural, religious, and aesthetic patrimony, an international coalition attempted to codify laws against such pillage. Article 56 of the Hague Convention of 1907 stated, "The property of municipalities, that of institutions dedicated to religion, charity, and education, the arts and sciences, even when state property, shall be treated as private property. All seizure of, destruction of willful damage done to institutions of this character, historic monuments, works of art and science, is forbidden and should be made the subject of legal proceedings." That's 1907. What was done? Very little. So they added protocols which they thought would help. In 1954, a further convention was signed at The Hague, Convention of Protection of Cultural Property in the event of armed conflict, and they thought that would give it some force. Today, UNESCO, the UN agency responsible for culture, attempts mediation in such cases. The more prominent cases usually end up in the courts. In order to have the greatest treasure hunt, as the monument, well, I'll change that. But now I'll leave it up. The Monuments book calls, you have to have the greatest theft in history. And certainly $1 trillion, I think, matches that. The greatest theft in history took place during the World War II era. Everything of value of every Jew, and there were 6 million killed, there were about 9 million in Europe, and millions of non-Jews in Germany and occupied Europe was confiscated. That territory, that occupied territory, represents 200 million people. Now, anywhere, as I said, in the East, anything could be confiscated from anyone. These were Untermenschen. In the West, they played games a little bit more, and they legalized their theft before they took it. They passed laws, either protecting art or whatever, for whatever reasons. If you emigrated from Germany, pre-war Germany, immediately after Hitler came to power, you could only take a minimum amount of money, about $50. Everything else was left. If you had no family, it went to the state. When Jews were relocated, everything of value in their homes was stolen by the SS, Gestapo, or the local police. The rest was confiscated. Those that were to be relocated, actually sent to concentration camps, were told to take their most valuable items with them in one suitcase. And upon arrival, everything, including the clothing, was taken from them. All this was sent back to Germany for turning into money or redistributed. Hundreds of thousands of everyday items, such as china, crystal, silver, whatnot, will never be recovered. Homes from mansions to hovels were sold or assigned. In the occupied Eastern Europe, homes left by Jews who fled or were taken to the camps were just reappropriated. As for Nazi theft, it was always covered by illegal laws passed by the Nazis. A DVD documentary, The Rape of Europe, which runs 117 minutes, records that the results are still playing out a half a century after World War II. These are just some, fairly recent clippings. Here's the one from the Times. Museum of Fine Arts has deal on paintings. Museum in Boston had negotiated so that they could keep, where is it? A Vandermeer painting. The person who owned it is dead. There's another one, Suit Over Loot Art, and this is the District Court of Washington says the Hungarian Empire cannot have its case dismissed. The government has to repay. Here's one local. This is the bottom one. Poignant ear to ear's pursuit of portrait. This is Rutgers University. Another one of the story of Rutgers. Rutgers returns art stolen by Nazis in Holland in 1940. Here's one on the Klimt, and I'm sure some of you know something about the Klimt portrait, $40 million. And let me get rid of all of this. For this one, because this is what we'll be talking about, Paris on Trail, and these are the monument men. Neuschwanstein, so it's probably 1945. Paul says it's still going on. Get rid of that. Property lost in the Holocaust is cataloged online. Just want to get the number of items. I know it's in here somewhere. At any rate, it includes tax records, voter, real estate and land, movable property like art and jewelry, and tangible personal property like stocks, bonds, savings accounts, etc. And somewhere in here, I know I had it. Websites in 13 languages. Seems to recall, I think over 1 million items were on that. Even before the war, the Nazis were confiscating all manner of art for different reasons. One was for profit. Some art was confiscated and sold to increase the coffers of the Third Reich. Some art was stolen or forced to be sold at outrageously low prices for personal gain. And some art was taken from artists and owners merely to be destroyed. Some of you may know about that. That's the Degenerate Art. This was an exhibition in Houston. How modern art escaped Hitler. All this was confiscated because it was against Nazi values. So it was either too modern, it was too intellectual, it made no sense to them. Much of this was destroyed. A lot of it was sold. They understood the value of it. It wouldn't be sold, it wouldn't be shown in Germany or occupied territory. It was sold outside. Much of what the Nazis did paid for their war. In one night, 1,004 oil paintings and sculptures were destroyed at the Berlin Fire Department, one night. This happened over and over again. Not that many times, but enough. And one last fire that they had was actually outside the Louvre, where they destroyed over 1,000 paintings. We all know about the book burnings. The most famous one, 1933, at the university in Berlin, outside the Operaplatz, but we don't know that much about the bonfires they had with art. Sorry. Artworks by the thousands were termed degenerate, not fit for viewing because of its negative antisocial message to society. This art had a corrupting effect on viewers. Its sources were either Jewish artists, like Chagall, Bolshevik. Jews were naturally Bolsheviks, Bolsheviks were Jews, or bourgeois capitalists. Hitler and his cronies deplored modern art. Anything non-representational, anti-war, expressionistic, realistic, experimental, all of that was condemned. And they passed a law against that as well. The great painters of the 20th century, Picasso, Matisse, Mondrian, Kokoschka, the Blue Reiter School, a German school, were all considered corrupting trash, and their work was forbidden. As the Nazis were pushed back and began their retreat in the West, France, Belgium, Italy, they increased their theft on a bolder and more passionate manner. As an example, they stole from a Bruges, Belgian church the only known Michelangelo statue outside of Italy during the artist's lifetime, a 5-foot Madonna and Child marble statue, which was put on a riverboat and shipped to Germany. And that we have here. This is the church in Bruges. And this is the Madonna and Child.
Did they ever recover it?
Oh, yes, it's there now. As a matter of fact, when I was there last year, I can't remember when, whatever it was, last year I think it was, I asked the guide, I said, oh, is that the one that was taken by the Nazis? And the guide, who was knowledgeable, very good young man, said, no, I don't think so. So as I was leaving, I asked someone in the church, said, was that taken by, oh yes, that was the one.
What countries were they selling stuff that they didn't want to keep? Was it Switzerland and Sweden?
Switzerland was the banker. Sweden was, that was a nice transit section for both the Allies and the Germans. They both used that very well. But they used, what they did was they sold to, or connived with, art sellers, people in the trade who had connections elsewhere. And so they would sell it in the West. They would sell it in the United States and South America and so forth. And then it would make those rounds. One of the problems is when they started doing that, they destroyed what's called provenance, the record of who owned what. And there are hundreds of paintings in major institutions, the Metropolitan, the National Museum, everywhere, where the provenance of many paintings are insecure. Now, the art organization, I can't recall what it is, they passed a resolution that this stuff should be returned if it's not clear where it came from. And so many things have been returned. The worst desecration of national heritage of historical and cultural monuments took place in the Nazis' retreat. Mainly through Hitler's orders and the demands of the Nazi hierarchy, the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS destroyed by dynamite and burning many of the palaces, public buildings, and the monuments out of sheer spite after a careful looting. Some of you may have heard of this place. It used to be called Leningrad. Yeah, St. Petersburg now, but that shows you how long ago this book was. One of the places that I went to was Catherine's Palace out in Pushkin. That's the way it looks now. World War II was partially destroyed. The interior was almost totally destroyed. No reason. No soldiers were stationed here. No fighting took place here. They just destroyed it out of sheer spite, maliciousness. And not only that, when I was in Poland, they told us the same thing had happened there. They also set booby traps, so any of the engineers coming in to fix it would die. There's just another picture. A nice bucolic scene, so forth. Of course, there were no statues there. They were all taken down. If you visit the palace today, I think it's still true. I was there, as I say, about, 15 years ago, so whenever, maybe 20 years ago. There's a picture in each room, and it shows what the Nazis left. And then you look around, it's still being rebuilt painstakingly, and it's been 50 years that they've been restoring it. One of the treasures permanently lost from the palace is the Amber Room, now partially restored through photographs. 173 Russian museums were plundered of hundreds of thousands of items. An unfinished catalog of stolen items listed 1,148,908 lost artworks. Now, on their side, the Russian army also had a special arts unit, counterpart to the Allied monument men, except its goal was to steal as much as possible from the defeated Germany as it could. This was considered not the spoils of war, but just retribution for what the Nazis had done to the USSR. And I think if you were Russian at that time, you would have agreed with them. It didn't matter to the Russians, however, if the art was originally German or whether it was stolen from the Nazis' victims. The Soviet Union refused to repatriate any of its booty until its collapse, when subsequent Russian governments returned some of it. Much of it is still there. When Paris was to be evacuated, Hitler himself gave the order that all major buildings and monuments were to be destroyed. The German general in charge of the destruction didn't follow through because of a combination of being intimidated by resistance leaders who told him that he would be treated as a war criminal, and possibly because he had a regard for the history and importance of the monuments. Operation Torch was the Allied invasion of North Africa, the first major move in the retaking of occupied territory. The British had been fighting a seesaw battle with the Axis powers in defending Egypt and the Suez Canal when they captured parts of Libya. That part included an ancient city, Leptis Magna, the most complete Roman ruin in Africa. This was the second British occupation of that Leptis Magna. During the first occupation, they paid no attention to the significance of the area, and they ran their trucks and their tanks right through it. When the Italians retook Leptis Magna, and this is after the first time the British were there, they unleashed a vicious propaganda effort on how the British had destroyed one of Western civilization's great archaeological sites. Of course, it was a great distortion because the damage had been done 1,000 years before. But the Italian photographs of broken columns and caved-in walls and scenes of desolation proved effective. So the British understood they've got to be a little more careful about things. This is very early in the war. In the second British occupation, a solitary soldier who knew the value of the venue successfully initiated the preservation of Leptis Magna. It was the first, but not unnoticed, achievement of what was to be called the Monuments Men. Alfred Rosenberg was one of the chief fabricators, I almost said something else, fabricators of, and that would be appropriate, of Nazi racial ideas dehumanizing Jews, Russians, Poles, and most of the people of Eastern Europe. When World War II began, Rosenberg was made head of the main Nazi looting organization, the Einsatzreichleiter Rosenberg, Special Purposes Rosenberg, also called for short for this ERR. Those were the initials. In a March 20th, 1941 report to Hitler, which stated that his looters had sent 25 baggage cars filled with the most valuable paintings, furniture, tapestries, Gobelin tapestries, works of artistic craftsmanship and ornaments to Neuschwanstein. Neuschwanstein is, of course, some of you don't know, maybe some of you have been there. The fairy castle, right, the fairy castle. Walt Disney, right, Disneyland's model. And that became the repository, of which much more later. It was built by Mad King Ludwig in the mountains outside Munich. What else is Mad King Ludwig should be known for? Because we all enjoy it. No. Oktoberfest. When he was married, that was what they started. That was the first Oktoberfest, and they continued it. Okay. These treasures came from, quote, now this is back again to the Rosenberg unit, the ERR. The treasures, the 25 boxcars that were sent to Neuschwanstein, they came from ownerless Jewish culture property. Actually, most of it came from the prize collections of the Rothschilds, the Seligmans, the Berheim-Juns, the Halperns, the Weil-Picards, and the Wildenstein. And certainly none of them were unknown. At that time, the ERR was already cataloging 4,000 individual pieces of the highest quality and artistic value. The ERR was then moving to confiscate additional abandoned Jewish art in France. Beside the special train to Neuschwanstein, the prototype for the Disneyland Palace, a special train of 2 cars containing masterpieces selected by Hermann Göring, himself selected from the Rothschild collection, had already been sent to Munich. So you see Nazis double dealing on themselves. Göring is probably next to Hitler, the one who confiscated most of the art, much of the art. Hitler had a grandiose future plans for Linz, the Austrian town in which he had grown to manhood. Here he would build the Führer Museum in which all the great art of Europe will be displayed. He had already begun his collection of stolen art, and he had already begun, some of you may have seen photographs of Hitler with Albert Speer. He had already designed what the museum would look like. They had models of them. Selection of all important art would first be made available to Hitler. Next in line would be Reich Marshal Göring, then the head of the looters organization, Alfred Rosenberg. Göring, however, with what he considered a superior taste in art, was already cheating. Much of the French art which was confiscated had been shipped to Paris, first to Paris, where a small museum, the Jeu de Paume, which is outside of the Louvre, right in a corner, it means tennis court. It doesn't mean, but that's what it was, an indoor tennis court. The Louvre Museum was chosen as a repository. First they would bring it there, then they would send it to the repositories elsewhere. Goering had visited the Louvre Museum, originally an indoor tennis court built by Napoleon III, 20 times, each time selecting paintings for his own personal collection. It was in the Jeu de Paume that one of the great French heroines of the Resistance worked. As an unpaid volunteer at the Little Museum, Rose Valland was asked by the Resistance to stay on after the occupation to learn as much as possible about the stolen art. Continually risking her life, she cataloged as much of the art as she could, and probably, most importantly, she found out the railroad car numbers of the art trains taking the treasures to Germany so that she could relay that information to the Resistance could get that to the Allies, so when they were bombing the railroads, and they were doing this constantly, they would not bomb art trains. She also learned of many of the hiding places. This information she eventually turned over to the Monuments Men and the U.S. Army. Rose Valland, who eventually became a curator at the Louvre, was the most decorated French woman of World War II. Rose was a French country girl entranced by French art. Even when not hired by the Louvre, she voluntarily worked at a small museum just outside the Louvre, the Jeu de Paume. When the Nazis occupied France, the Jeu de Paume became the repository for the ERR, which was confiscating art treasures from the prominent Jewish families and collectors. She was asked to stay on as an art functionary to collect as much information as to what the Germans were doing. During 4 years of spying, Rose recorded about 20,000 pieces of art which were brought to the Jeu de Paume by the ERR for sorting. It was a very dangerous assignment because snooping could get her killed. Several times she was accused of spying, but her mouse-like exterior and the befriending of confidant German staff members saved her each time. As a matter of fact, at the end of the war, when the Nazis were trying to cover up everything, you know, in the death camps, they had the pits where they burned, they had them dug up to get rid of whatever evidence they could. They tried to destroy everything. They also tried to destroy witnesses. And so people who were working with Rose at the Jeu de Paume disappeared. Rose used the more informed staff, the German staff members, to extort valuable information. She found out the destinations of most of the art shipments. In August 1944, the Nazis rushed to evacuate their massive illegal haul. Incredibly, Rose even secured the numbers of the train and the boxcars which were to take the last train load to Germany. Because of several delays, that train never got far from Paris. Then the Allies were coming in very, very quickly. Rose reported her information to the Resistance, and almost all of the artwork and the treasure were safe for France. A film, many of you have seen it, The Train, featuring Burt Lancaster, was based on this incident. Subsequently, Rose passed on the information of several of the major German and Austrian repositories to Monuments Man, Second Lieutenant James R. Roramore. The Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives program under the Civil Affairs and Military Government section of the United States Army was established in 1943. This group of men and women were organized to protect the thousands of historic and cultural monuments from war damage. Approximately 400 men and women of the MFAA were largely art historians and museum personnel from the greatest cultural institutions in the United States, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the National Gallery of Art, as well as comparable institutions located in Europe, constitutions in Europe. They eventually tracked, located, and returned 5 million artistic and cultural items stolen by the Nazis. Such an action is totally unprecedented. Before the United States entered World War II, American individuals and organizations were concerned and began working for the protection of Europe's art and monuments as war and the Nazi theft threatened them. The director of the Museum of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Francis Henry Taylor, went to Washington, D.C. to express these concerns. It was not until June 23, 1943, that Franklin Delano Roosevelt created the American Commission for the Protection and Salvage of Artistic and Historic Monuments in War Areas. Under its chairman, Supreme Court Justice Owen J. Roberts, the commission, then being called the Roberts Commission, provided lists and reports on Europe's cultural treasures to military units of Allied ground troops of what should be protected, as long as it didn't interfere with military operations. One reason for action in 1943 was the absolute domination of the skies by the United States and its allies, particularly because we had invaded Italy in 1943. And as we got closer to Rome and the Vatican, it became essential that careful planning be done. The Roberts Commission, which established the monuments, fine arts, and archives units within the Allied armies, also aided in restitution of Nazi-looted art to rightful owners and promoted public awareness of the extent of the Nazi looting. By 1943, the Allies, and this is what I was saying before, extended the distance of their bombing runs. The introduction of the P-51 fighter, a long-range pursuit ship, and equal to the best planes the Germans had, allowed fighter escort to go deep into Germany and Italy, accompanying the big bombers, the B-17s, the B-29s, the Lancasters, and so forth. Realizing that damage to churches and historical buildings by what is now known as collateral damage, President Roosevelt ordered that all care be taken in air and artillery bombardments. Although the United States Air Force had propagandized that with the possession of the Norden bomb site, it enabled it to pinpoint a target. How many of you were in the Air Force in World War II? Or I guess, do you remember the Norden bomb site? Yeah, there you go. Right, I got into a little bit of a discussion. I was teaching a World War II course, or maybe it was just American history. I don't know. And one of the students was a bombardier, and he said, "I could put that in a pickle barrel."
The problem with that is the saying where they put in a pickle barrel in Napa Valley, or probably the Central Valley of California, because the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey pointed out that a bomb was considered a hit target that was 2 miles of its objective. Right.
And because you don't know about the variance of wind, and so although the bomb site's supposed to correct all those things, it's an early computer. You can't see through clouds. So at any rate, by the turning point of the war, carpet bombing was the tactic used by the massive air raids, which included 1,000-plane raids. How were you going to pinpoint with 1,000 planes? What you did is you just dropped your bombs as you went along, and a row here, a row there, row there, row there. Devastated. As the Allies advanced up the boot of Italy toward Rome and its huge numbers of historical monuments and buildings, and particularly the territory of the Vatican and St. Peter's, it was imperative that careful planning to protect these monuments had to be implemented. A direct order came from FDR to spare all cultural treasures. General Eisenhower personally forbade any looting, destruction, or untoward usage such as billeting, storage, etc., of significant historic buildings. He ordered his armies to render as much assistance as possible to the monuments men. This was the first time in history an army attempted to fight a war and at the same time mitigate damage to cultural monuments and property. British Lieutenant Colonel Sir Leonard Woolley, a monuments man officer, wrote, "Prior to this war, no army had thought of protecting the monuments of the country in which and with which it was at war, and there was no precedent to follow." All this was changed by a general order issued by Supreme Commander-in-Chief Eisenhower just before he left Algiers, before we even went into Europe. An order accompanied by a personal letter to all commanders, quote, "The good name of the Army depended in great measure on the respect which it showed to the art heritage of the modern world." A tiny number of monument men working without supervision or written guidance proceeded on their own training and instincts to save the designated monuments. It had never happened before. Who are you going to follow? What was the precedent? Who were the authorities? They had to make it up as they went along. And as Paul wrote in the introduction to this tonight, they got no material support. There was none to give. They didn't even get typewriters, let alone some of the type. Although under the support of Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, the monument used their intelligence, wit, and persuasion to get field officers and the men to cooperate in MAFF's goals. Many of these men, and you read that if you read the monuments men, somehow out of the commandeered jeeps and drove them all over the place through different lines, different army lines, and so forth, all using their own motivation. Several months after D-Day, there were fewer than a dozen monument men in Normandy. A dozen men, hundreds of thousands of artifacts. As an example of monument assistance, however, to battle planning, Allied troops relied on aerial photographs taken by MFAA men, which had monuments of cultural importance marked so that pilots and bombardiers could avoid damaging such sites. When monuments were damaged, monument men assessed the damages and began preventive first aid to assist in the eventual restoration. Some of the monuments men called Venus fixers by their fellow soldiers, referring to the armless Venus de Milo, stayed in Europe for working on restitution of property 6 years after the hostilities ended. And where's the people? Yes, you want to mention your friend, the monuments?
Well,
Can you hear him? Maybe I have to...
there's a gentleman who had a career as an art historian, was sent to repatriate Hitler's cache of art.
Right. And what year was it?
I think 1946.
So it's after the war.
46.
Most of the men who were monument men, or women who were monument men, were after the war. During the war, very, very few actually were working doing this. Once again, the efficiency and that's quotes because it's ironic. The efficiency and future planning of the Nazi regime's chief failure was never thinking of retreat or defeat. As the Allies began to pound Germany from the air, museum and library officials considered moving objects to safer places. Logical? Unfortunately for them, any such suggestion smacked of defeatism, a crime punishable by death. So you say, well, I want to move this to save it. Oops, defeatism. By 1943, however, Hitler became anxious about his art treasures for the Fuhrer Museum. The Altasai salt mine was the major site of several requisitions by Hitler to store some of the artworks stolen throughout the Nazi-occupied Europe. From May 1944 to April 45, so that's just over a year, which, by the way, 45 is the month that, April 45, that's when Hitler commits suicide. More than 1,687 paintings arrived from the Führer's office in Munich. And that's just to one site. The Ghent altarpiece was transferred there from Neuschwanstein. Michelangelo's Bruges Madonna arrived in 1944. Preparation for storing Nazi loot began in earnest in 1944, very late, because the Allies were pounding Germany by this time. More than 1,000 sites were chosen, covering an area of over 100,000 square miles. 1,000 sites where art was supposed to be hidden, was going to be hidden. Several salt mines had been, which had been worked since before medieval times, were on levels that ran more than 2,000 feet, some even deeper, and extended for as much as 35 miles, tunnels going all over. Some mines had over 150 tunnels in them. An MFAA man, James Rohrmoor, mentioned before, pretty much accidentally discovered the Heilbronn salt mine, which contained 40,000 cases of artworks. A similar situation in Merkers happened when an MP stopped two displaced persons because they were out after curfew. And the two women were questioned about being out after curfew. The driver inquired about some slashes that he saw on a hillside. One of the women pointed to the hill and said, "Or," the French word for gold, then expanded, "lingot d'or," gold bars. When two monuments men arrived 2 days later, the entrance was guarded by several groups of soldiers, American soldiers, and anti-aircraft guns. More than 100 men were detailed for the duty. As they continued to pass more and more inspection and sentry posts, they decided that at least half a battalion, at least 200 men, were posted there. An old wooden elevator took them down 2,500 feet, almost half a mile. I'm only going to mention, in some short biography, just two of the monuments men. Although there were several prominent men in the Monument Men, MFAA, and its creators, the most recognizable was Lincoln Kirstine. Born to a wealthy Jewish Boston family, Kirstine was the son of the president of Filene's department store. Many of you shop Filene's basement. What an experience. Gone forever. At Harvard, he schooled with Varian Fry. Some of you took Holocaust courses, know who Varian Fry is. Varian Fry was to be his future brother-in-law and one of the first heroes of the Holocaust. Fry was responsible for saving thousands of lives, including internationally known artists and intellectuals. Among the latter were Hannah Arendt, Jean Arp, Marc Chagall, Jacques Lipschitz, Marcel Duchamp, Arthur Koestler, and that's just to name a few. In 1948, along with George Balanchine, he founded the New York City Ballet. Kirstine was one of the most multi-talented cultural icons in the United States, working in ballet, film, literature, theater, painting, sculpture, and photography. In 1984, President Reagan presented Kirstine with the Presidential Medal of Freedom for his contribution to the arts. As the two monument men continued to pass more and more inspection and sentry posts, they decided there was at least half a battalion there. An old wooden elevator took them down 2,100 feet, almost half a mile. And for this, let me go. The elevator opened into a scene out of Dante's Inferno. Darkness, shadows, men running in every direction, steam, water, wires, sprawling insect-like metal equipment, officers barking order, and every echo sounding over and over again off the stone. The lights, at least the ones operational, threw deformed images on the wall and revealed layers of white rime on the necks and arms of most of the men. Hoses were being used to spray down men and equipment, and the water was collecting in slushy puddles on the floor. Within seconds, it seemed, Kirstine was wet from the humidity. He reached up to wipe his brow, then massage his aching throat. "It's the mineral water salts in the walls," someone said, handing him a rag. "Take this to cover your nose. Use it to wipe down your boots when you're back up top. That salt water will eat through the leather in a day." They passed more soldiers on guard in a group hauling away a big pile of paper currency that was dumped near the elevator. Nazi bank officials had tried to evacuate the currency the week before, but it was Easter Sunday, and no one was on duty at the train station. Beyond the currency was a sandbagged artillery emplacement manned by a couple of silent GIs in flak helmets. Beyond them was a great steel bank vault door. Apparently nobody had a key because they had blasted a hole in the 3-foot thick wall that surrounded it. Captain Posey and Leonard Kirstine crawled through the opening. The first thing they saw was an American officer getting his picture taken. In his hands was a helmet overflowing with gold coins. Behind him was room 8, the great Nazi treasure room. Lincoln Kirstine stood up. Above him, the massive stone ceiling gleamed with a reflection of 100 lights. He estimated 150 feet long, at least, without a single support column, and another 75 feet across. How high? Maybe 20 feet. Beneath the lights ran a railroad track. A few carts were down the far end of the room, being loaded with boxes. Posey thought the rows of boxes looked short and unimpressive, and then he realized it was all perspective. Each box was taller than the soldier loading it. In front of the boxes, covered most of the floor, were thousands of bags. They were all identical, plain brown, about the size of a loaf of bread, and tied off at the top. They were piled 4 high and 5 across, 20 rows per section with a footpath between each. Kirstine tried to count the sections, but it was impossible. The last section was so far away he couldn't see the paths of the bags. They just looked like dots in the distance. And each one of those bags, all 1,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 of them, was filled with gold. The artwork stored in a nearby room was mostly paintings. Some were boxed, some were marked in marked containers. Others were wrapped only in brown paper. A large number were stacked upright in wooden holding pens, like posters at a 5 and dime. Kirstine flipped through them. A lovely Caspar David Friedrich painting of a distant schooner. Friedrich was an important German painter. Of a distant schooner. Had a nasty rip, but appeared unharmed otherwise. "Not much considering," said Posey. "Oh, that's not all," the passing officer said with a laugh. "There are miles of tunnels down here." And so it went on and on and on. Let me take that one out. Altersee, Austria was the result of more than 2,000 years of exploitation of salt buried beneath the ground Salt was one of the foundations of civilization. Primarily, salt was not for flavoring, but for preserving foods. The Visigoths of the region were dependent on salt. Roman soldiers were paid in salt at times. Altersee, high in the mile-high Alps, was first violated by tracked vehicles and an endless line of trucks coming over the treetop-level snow to deliver the first art treasures to be hidden against Allied air raids in 1943. Soon, the mine at Altersee was requisitioned by Adolf Hitler to protect his mostly stolen art, destined to he thought eventually to the Führer Museum in Linz. Among the crates of art moved into Aldersee were 8 crates belonging to a Nazi Gauleiter, however. These 8 crates contained a 500-kilogram bomb, about 1,100 pounds of explosive. If the Allies took over the territory, they were to be detonated. Such an action was to be incorporated in Hitler's scorched earth policy, the Nero Decree, to destroy everything and anything that might be of value or benefit the oncoming Allied armies. There were many mines and hiding places to be discovered and treasure to be collected, all against a pressing timeline. For the Americans had captured land that was by treaty at Yalta to be turned over to the Soviet Union, and that included Aldersee and Neuschwanstein, as well as the rocket base and factory at Peenemünde. Nazi propaganda had promoted the cudgel of no surrender to its public, and promulgated the final suicidal measure of the Volkssturm, the People's Army. And a final holdout bastion was to be the Alps Redoubt, to be manned by the Werewolf Corps. The first was a poorly trained, poorly equipped civilian army. The last 2 were merely figures of fertile imagination. There was no Alps Redoubt, and there was very little of a Werewolf Corps. However, General Eisenhower believed the Redoubt story, the ruse, and it was a place, he thought, to which Hitler might escape and hold out in that hugely inhospitable landscape for many more months, if not years. So instead of pressing toward Berlin, Patton's desired target, he turned the Third Army south toward Munich. In the Thuringian forest of Germany, a mine in Burton Road was found to house an ammunition dump holding 400,000 tons of explosives. There also was discovered there a reliquary of Germany's most prized historical relics. Let me go to the book again on this. Well, let me see. George Stout, one of the important monument men, crawled through the wall opening and into the room. Even he, who had been at Saigon and Merkers, never imagined. There was a wide central passage ablaze with light and lined with wooden racks and storage compartments. From the compartments hung 225 flags and banners, all unfurled with decorative effects on the finials. They were German regimental banners dating from the early Prussian wars to World War I. Near the entrance of the chamber were boxes and paintings, and in the bays, Stout could see carefully arranged tapestries and other decorative works. In a few of the bays, Stout noticed large caskets, several large caskets. 3 were unadorned. 1 wore a wreath, red ribbons, and a name, Adolf Hitler. But of course, Hitler wasn't in it. Stout walked into the bay that held the decorated casket. Above him, the flags hung limply, some of the older flags in nets to hold them together. A crude label written in red crayon and held on with tape read, Friedrich Wilhelm I, der Soldatenkönig. Frederick William I, the soldier king, dead since 1940. Then they found the coffin of Field Marshal von Hindenburg, the greatest German hero of World War I, and beside him his wife. The 4th coffin contained the remains of Frederick the Great, the son of the soldier king. Where did Hitler get these coffins, and so forth and so on? It's a coronation chamber, Hancock said. They were going to crown Hitler the Emperor of Europe, or the world, Stout said. And they went through it, and they found other things that were important to the Reich. And then they realized this isn't a coronation room, Stout said. It's a reliquary. They were hiding the most precious artifacts of the German military state. This room was intended for Hitler. It wasn't intended for Hitler. It was intended for the next Reich, so that they could build upon his glory. The 7th Army was closing in on the ferry castle at Neuschwanstein, but it had not been secured. Racing against time, monument man James Rohrmoor could not sit still waiting. Instead, he took a detour to nearby Buxheim and discovered there a monastery filled with Renaissance art. Neuschwanstein lay at the end of a long, treacherous hairpin drive through the dense mountains of the German-Austrian border, a perfect reflection of the course his search had taken him. Roosevelt had told him. He had gone to the City of Light hoping to find great monuments and buildings. Now he was driving a Red Cross truck through the German countryside, helping to find stuffed into a remote castle one of the largest collections of masterpieces ever assembled. Had it been moved or worse, destroyed? He wasn't sure. And it was exactly as Roosevelt had said. The American unit that had taken the castle reported no resistance, and the total arms confiscated from the Germans' residents amounted to a couple of shotguns. Thanks to Roosevelt's information and Rohrmoor's efforts, the unit had known the importance of the castle and it had been sealed and placed off limits immediately upon its capture. No one of any rank had entered the treasure rooms. And so they went through that. They got help from some of the Germans who had some notes about what had been taken. Without them, it would have taken 20 years to identify the agglomeration of loot. A catalog of some 21,000 confiscated items of French treasure were saved. And all to say, a complicated, conniving plot by some Nazi functionaries stopped the Gauleiter's plan of detonating his 8 500 kilogram bombs. What they'd done was place small explosives, but it did seal the entrance, the main entrance, and 137 tunnels. What eventually were rescued from the Nazi robbers was well, they did discover the Michelangelo, and then they discovered the Vermeer studio, as well as the Rothschild's Vermeer, the astronomer. The astronomer was the most favored painting of Hitler. That was to be the center of the Führer Reichsmuseum. Came from the Rothschild family. What they had discovered was 6,577 paintings, 230 drawings and watercolors, 954 prints, 137 pieces of sculpture, 129 pieces of armor, 75 baskets of objects, 484 cases of objects thought to be archives, 78 pieces of furniture, 122 tapestries, 181 case books, 1,200 to 1,700 cases, apparently books or similar, 283 cases, contents completely unknown. So that's what they were looking for. Within 4 days, now they thought that they had a couple of weeks to get this stuff out, but the Russians were moving in less than a week. With 4 days left before Alta-Sea and numerous other repositories were turned over to the Soviets, the monuments men shifted into high gear to face their Herculean task of evacuating as much as they could, including the priceless Ghent altarpiece and the Bruges Madonna. In a little more than 13 months, monuments man George Stout had discovered, analyzed, and packed tens of thousands of pieces of artwork, including 80 truckloads from Alta-Sea alone. Once the treasures were found, it was less than half of the job. And this is, finally, this is the job. The end of active hostilities was not the end of the monuments men's work. Not by far. As the situation in Alta Sea demonstrated, finding looted Nazi treasures was just the first step of a very long process. The treasures had to be inspected and cataloged, then packed and shipped out of the mines, the castles, the monasteries, or simply holes in the ground where they'd been stored. Almost every site contained Nazi archives, which also had to be transported so that researchers could determine where the artwork had come from and who was the rightful owner. The archives inevitably led to the discovery of other repositories, as did interviews with the Nazis now being rounded up by the collapsed German-Austrian state. And almost every day, Army units stumbled upon unfathomable treasures hidden in basements, train cars, food caches, and oil barrels. By June 4th, less than a month since the hostilities, 175 repositories had been found in U.S. 7th Army territory alone. And the MFA, as was said before, were adding officers and enlistment as quickly as possible. A vast majority of the almost 350 men and women who served in the multinational force joined after the end of combat. But still only a handful of those mines and castles had been emptied, and every piece that was brought out of a hole had to be taken somewhere. Fortunately, the industrious and insightful James Roramore had managed to secure the most coveted buildings in Munich. The former Nazi headquarters Nazi party headquarters complex, and soon thereafter they moved to Marburg University and to Wiesbaden, and these were the major points. James Roramore, meanwhile, never stayed in one place long, and soon he was bringing along Harry Ettlinger, the German Jewish-American private from Karlsruhe, who had wandered into his office the day before Germany's surrender as his personal translator. Suddenly, Harry's tour of duty was as breakneck and interesting as his previous 4 months of service had been plodding and dull. Who was Harry Ettlinger? Private Harry Ettlinger, U.S. 7th Army, at the time, 1944, was 18 years of age, born in Karlsruhe, Germany, emigrated to Newark, New Jersey. So New Jersey has the last word. A German Jew, Ettlinger fled Nazi persecution in 1938 with his family. Drafted by the Army after graduating from high school in Newark in 1944, Private Ettlinger spent much of his tour of duty lost in the Army bureaucracy before finally finding his niche in early May 1945. Harry accompanied Roramore to Berchtesgaden. While Roramore dealt with the art treasures in the village, the Reichsmarshal wasn't the only Nazi official who had hidden his stolen loot near the former Nazi stronghold. Harry went up the mountain to Hitler's chalet, known as the Berghof. He stood alone in the Führer's living room and stared through the enormous window, the glass long gone, out of which Adolf Hitler had so often surveyed his empire. How did it feel for a German Jew whose friends and relatives had died in the Holocaust to stand among the conquerors of in the halls of the defeated dictator? It felt good. The house had been picked over by visiting troops, but Harry managed to scrounge a few epaulets and some paper bearing the lead head of a high SS general. He looked out over Germany, now free, and thought those three simple words: it feels good. So that's just an introduction to the Mountain Men. And as I say, their story continues on and on. Just watch your local papers, see what they're doing. Thank you. If you have any questions, I'll try to handle them. Yes?
Most of the work that they found in the mines, were they in good condition? Because you were talking about how the salt water alone could have went through.
No, because the mines also had the right temperature for preserving it. So the temperature was important. And the Allied bombing destroyed a lot of the machines that were keeping the mines, the humidity down. So there were problems of that sort, but most things were easily restored.
All that gold that they found in there, that was the profits from the sale of the art? No. You talked about these bags of gold.
No, that was the German bank. They wanted to move it to save it. And all German property went back to Germany, that the monuments men got. Nothing was confiscated.
Jack, did they get most of the art out before the Russians came?
Yes, they did. Yes, they did. But the Russians, of course, came into other areas. They had lots of stuff.
In many respects, Hitler was a neoclassicist in his art taste, and a lot of what he did in terms of looting was not considered to be looting. It was considered to be sequestering to pay for the war. In fact, one time he was asked by the president of the Reichsbank, this war is bankrupting the country, what are we going to do? He says, we have two choices, one or the other. Either we will win this war and then we will simply extract the cost of this war from the conquered territories, or two, we'll lose and we have nothing to fear then because we'll all be gone anyway.
Right.
So it was a very Weltgang oder Niedergang, world power or ruin type of philosophy, which goes back to the
It was a very evil plot. The victims paid for the war.
Oh, yeah. Well, again, everybody does. If you look at medieval history or even ancient history, look at what the Romans did to Carthage. They just obliterated it completely and took everything they wanted. So this goes back to like 2,000 years earlier in terms of its mindset.
But to mention, I hope there's a difference in the level of civilization between then and modern
Not really.
times.
Look what happened in Iraq when the fall of Saddam Hussein, they started looting museums almost immediately.
Right, but you know,
changed,
the playing field isn't quite level here, there, elsewhere.
Is there any trace of the works that were destroyed and burned? Any list, any documentation? Who were the artists? I mean, you mentioned some, but and who were the owners?
Well, what they did was they destroyed what they considered degenerate art, asocial, antisocial art. There probably is no list. They wouldn't catalog anything they're going to destroy. But they did know some of the work of people who, you know, if it was a painting that people knew or an artist that people knew, they knew a Picasso had been destroyed then. And then if they could describe it, they might know which Picasso it was. But when you figure you're having a bonfire and you've got 1,000 pieces there, it's not orderly. You have no idea what's being destroyed.
Okay.
Oh, no,
There was one final thing, that a lot of the artwork before the war was sold through Amsterdam.
yes.
And then from Amsterdam, it went to places like Harry Winston in New York, and it was the first city bank, the first national bank, which actually would sell it for an exchange. It was stripped back through Switzerland to help finance.
Yeah, they had networks, right?
Yeah, they had a network of
Right,
financial,
and they were working with reputable people.
Oh, yeah.
So you had thief, disreputable, and then followed through to reputable people. And so the provenance of paintings,
Became so muddy.
right, absolutely.
Okay. Any other questions?
All right, if not, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. Let's give Jack Needle one more round of applause. Very good, Jack, very good. That's it, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for coming. Please have a safe trip back home.
We hope you enjoyed this program. For more information on the Center for World War II Studies, visit brookdalecc.edu/pages/730.asp. This program series is available for sponsorship by corporations and organizations. You can find out more information about sponsorship at bit.ly/content sponsorship. We produce this program in the studios of Lubetkin Global Communications in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, on the web at lubetkin.net. This program is copyright Lubetkin Communications, and all rights are reserved. No reposting or other use of this program may be made without written permission from the copyright owner. For Paul Zygo and everyone at the Brookdale Center for World War II Studies, this is Steve Lubetkin. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you out there on the net. Take good care.